The sun had barely cracked the horizon, casting a pale light over the sprawling camp. The air was crisp, with a chill that seeped into the bones of the weary soldiers. They stirred, groggily emerging from their makeshift shelters, constructed from scraps of canvas and wooden frames. The ground beneath their feet was hard, uneven, and cold. It was a harsh morning, one that seemed to echo the hardships that lay ahead. Amidst the sea of tired faces, one young soldier, Edward, slowly sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His stomach growled, a familiar pang that seemed to be a constant companion on these long marches. He had been looking forward to a hot meal, but the reality was far from it. Hard bread and dried meat were staples of their diet, and even those were scarce at times. Hunger was a feeling he had grown accustomed to, but it never seemed to get any easier. As he stood up, the weight of his armor bore down on him. The heavy steel plate, designed to protect him from the enemy, felt like a burden, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked ahead. The terrain was rough, with uneven paths and steep inclines that seemed to stretch on forever. The soldiers had been marching for days, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. One misstep, one wrong move, could mean disaster. The camp was slowly coming to life, with the sound of clanging steel and the murmur of hushed conversations. Edward knew that the day ahead would be long, filled with the constant threat of attack, ambush, or sudden violence. The enemy was out there waiting, and they would not hesitate to strike. He felt a familiar sense of fear creeping in, a cold dread that seemed to settle in the pit of his stomach. As he made his way to the center of the camp, Edward caught sight of the makeshift infirmary. A tent marked with a crude red cross stood out among the sea of soldiers. He had seen it before, had even been there himself after a skirmish with the enemy. The medical care was basic, and the memories of the infections, the untreated wounds, and the countless lives lost still lingered in his mind. The discomfort of his clothing was another constant reminder of the hardships he faced. The heavy armor, though necessary, was a source of pain and fatigue. The fabric of his tunic, rough and coarse, chafed against his skin, making every step feel like a trial. And then there was the issue of hygiene. Bathing was a luxury they could ill afford, and the water, when available, was often murky and foul. Discipline was strict, with harsh rules and punishments for even the slightest infraction. There was little personal freedom, and every move was watched, every action scrutinized. The emotional strain was taking its toll, with homesickness, loss, and uncertainty about survival hanging over them like a specter. As night began to fall, Edward found himself lying on the hard ground, his stomach growling, his body aching. The open skies above offered little comfort, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones. Sleep was fitful, restless, and short. Another day, another night, another cycle of hardships in a never-ending struggle for survival. The first pale light of sunrise slipped over the ridge, painting the ragged silhouettes of the soldiers in a thin wash of gray. Edward rose again, the cold biting his cheeks as he pulled his tunic tighter around his shoulders. The camp was already stirring, A low murmur rose from the rows of tents as men exchanged weary greetings and checked their gear. The smell of damp earth mingled with the faint scent of the fire that had been left smoldering through the night. A courier, his cloak patched with the colors of the kingdom, slipped through the encampment with a leather satchel clutched to his chest. He halted before the commander, a broad-shouldered veteran named Captain Roderick, and whispered urgently. The captain's brow furrowed, and he motioned for the nearest soldiers to gather. Edward felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders as the captain's voice cut through the cold air. "The enemy has moved faster than we anticipated," Roderick announced, his tone flat but edged with urgency. "Intelligence reports a battalion entrenched at the pass, ready to ambush us at first light. We must take the high ground before they can seal the gorge." A ripple of murmurs ran through the men. Some clenched their fists, others stared at the ground, the fatigue of weeks evident in their eyes. Edward's stomach tightened, not from hunger this time, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. He tightened the straps of his armor, feeling the familiar pressure of steel against his ribs, and stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "if we take the ridge at dawn, we can outflank them. The path is narrow, but the wind will carry our arrows down into the pass." Roderick nodded, his gaze lingering on Edward for a heartbeat before turning to the rest of the company. "We move at first light. Those who are too weak to march will stay in the infirmary. The rest will form 3 squads, one to hold the ridge, one to press forward through the valley, and a reserve to cover any retreat. Keep your heads low, trust your comrades, and remember why we fight." The soldiers broke into a disciplined shuffle, gathering their spears, swords, and the few bundles of provisions left. Edward found himself paired with a grizzled veteran named Tomas, whose scarred face bore the map of countless battles. Tomas offered a brief, rough smile. "First time you've seen a real ambush?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Edward shook his head. "No, only the endless march and the hunger." Tomas chuckled, a sound that seemed to crack the cold. "Then you'll learn quickly. Keep your shield up, watch the ground, and don't let the fear settle in your gut. Fear makes you slow, speed saves you." The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the camp as the men formed their lines. The distant clang of metal echoed as the blacksmith gave a final polish to a few battered swords. Edward felt the weight of his own blade, its balance familiar in his hand, and the cold steel of his shield resting against his forearm. When the horn sounded, a low, mournful note that cut through the morning mist, the company began its march. The path to the ridge wound through a forest of twisted pines, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The ground was slick with dew, each step a careful negotiation between footing and fatigue. Halfway up the slope, a sudden crack split the air. A volley of arrows arced from the trees ahead, darkening the sky before thudding into the earth around them. The enemy had been waiting. Edward felt the sting of a near miss as an arrow whistled past his ear, embedding itself in the bark of a pine. "Shield up," Tomas shouted, swinging his own shield to deflect a second volley. The men formed a tight wall, their shields interlocking, creating a moving fortress against the hail of steel. Edward thrust his sword forward, cutting through the thin line of attackers that emerged from the shadows. The clash was brutal and brief. Steel sang against steel, and the smell of blood mingled with the pine sap. He caught a glimpse of a face half hidden beneath a blackened helm, a young enemy soldier, eyes wide with the same terror Edward felt within himself. The battle surged forward, the two forces colliding on the narrow ridge. The wind carried the cries of the wounded, the clang of swords, and the guttural shouts of commanders. Edward fought with a rhythm born of desperation and training, each strike a prayer for survival, each block a promise to his comrades. When the sun reached its zenith, the enemy's numbers began to thin. Their lines faltered, and a roar rose from Edward's side as they pushed the remaining foes back into the gorge. The pass, once a looming threat, now lay behind them, its shadows receding as the light washed over the battlefield. Exhausted, bloodied but alive, Edward slumped against a stone outcrop, his breath ragged. Tomas knelt beside him, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. "We held," Tomas said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "We held the ridge." Edward looked out over the valley, the distant smoke of the enemy camp curling into the sky. The weight of his armor still pressed down, but for the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than dread sparked in his chest. A fragile, hard-won hope that perhaps the endless cycle of hardship could be broken, one hard-won victory at a time. The boy's eyes lingered on the horizon, where the faint glow of the enemy camp still smoldered. "Do you think they'll come back?" he whispered, the question hanging in the cold night air. Edward glanced back at the flickering torches that dotted the ridge, casting wavering shadows on the stone walls. "They will," he said, his voice steady despite the fatigue that clung to his bones. "But we'll be ready. We've learned how to turn fear into fire." A rustle behind them drew their attention. Tomas emerged from the darkness, his cloak damp from the evening mist, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. "A scout returned," he announced, setting the satchel down with a thud. "The enemy camp is moving. They're pulling back toward the river, but they left a small detachment to guard the ridge. They think we're too exhausted to follow." Edward's mind raced. The ridge gave them a commanding view of the valley, and holding it meant controlling the only pass through the mountains. If the enemy regrouped, they could strike again before dawn. He turned to the assembled men, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "We cannot linger here forever," he said, feeling the weight of command settle once more. "We need to secure the pass, then move to the river and cut them off. If we can block their retreat, we'll force a surrender or at least cripple their supply line." A murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks. The younger soldiers, still raw from the day's bloodshed, tightened their grips on their swords, while the veterans nodded, their eyes reflecting the fire's light. Tomas stepped forward, unfastening a battered map from his belt. He spread it on a flat stone, the inked lines barely visible in the dimness. "The river runs 3 miles east," he explained, tracing a narrow bend with his finger. "There's a ford we can use, but it's guarded by a narrow bridge. If we take that bridge, we can block their crossing and force them to fight on our terms." Edward studied the map, his mind cataloging every ridge, every hollow, every potential ambush point. He remembered the blackened helm he had seen earlier, the terror in that young enemy's eyes, and the realization that both sides were driven by the same desperate hope. "We'll split into 3 groups," he decided. "One will hold the ridge and keep the enemy from reoccupying it. The second will move to the bridge and set up a defensive line. The third, led by me, will take the high ground behind the bridge and rain arrows down on any who try to cross. We'll need every hand." The men set to work with practiced efficiency. The blacksmith, whose hammer had sung all morning, now forged makeshift spikes to line the ridge's edge. The medics tended to the wounded, binding torn flesh, with strips of cloth and whispering prayers that sounded more like promises. The boy, still trembling, was assigned to a group of seasoned archers, his hands guided to steady the bowstring, his eyes learning to read the distance between target and arrow. Night deepened, and a thin veil of mist rolled in from the valley, cloaking the ridge in a ghostly shroud. Edward stood at the edge of the camp, the wind tugging at his cloak, and felt the weight of the moment settle like a stone in his chest. He thought of the faces he had seen, friend and foe alike, each a story cut short by steel and fire. He thought of the fragile hope that had sparked within him earlier, now tempered by the resolve of his comrades. A distant horn sounded, low and mournful, echoing off the pine-laden cliffs. The enemy was moving. Edward raised his sword, the blade catching a stray ember from the fire, and the light flared across his armor. "For the ridge," he called, his voice carrying over the mist. "For those who cannot fight, and for those who will never see home again." The men answered with a unified shout, their voices rising above the rustle of the trees. As the first pale light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the company slipped from their makeshift camp, moving like a silent tide toward the river. The ridge behind them stood as a silent sentinel, its stones still stained with the night's blood, but now guarded by a resolve that would not be broken. The sound of clashing steel rose above the din, a metallic roar that seemed to split the morning air. From the ridge, the blacksmith's spiked barricade began to bite into the enemy's advance, men stumbling over the jagged iron as they tried to maintain formation. Arrows still whistled from Edward's line, each shaft finding a gap in armor or a vulnerable throat, and the boy, now steadier, his hands no longer trembling, released a volley that split a cluster of foes in two. One of the fallen soldiers, a young man with a scar across his cheek, let out a guttural gasp before the darkness claimed him, his eyes locking briefly with the boy before fading. On the bridge, Tomas and his second group had already erected a crude but effective line of defense. Wooden planks reinforced with iron bands creaked under the weight of the first wave of attackers. The enemy's shield bearers slammed their shields against the railings, trying to force a breach, while their spearmen thrust forward in a coordinated push. Tomas barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos, and the men behind him thrust their spears in unison, forming a wall of iron points that halted the onslaught for a heartbeat. Edward felt the ground tremble as the main body of the enemy surged forward, a tide of steel and desperation. He tightened his grip on his sword, the blade slick with the cold sweat of his palm. From his perch, he could see the ridge defenders holding fast, the bridge fighters locked in a brutal stalemate, and the river below, its waters churning with the reflected firelight of the battle. A sudden, guttural howl rose from the far side of the bridge, a war cry that seemed to summon more men from the misty woods beyond. The enemy's commander, a towering figure in a blackened helm that had haunted Edward's thoughts earlier, emerged from the ranks. He rode a massive war horse, its coat as dark as the night they had left behind, and brandished a great axe that caught the first rays of sunrise. With a sweeping motion, he struck down a defender on the bridge, sending the man's helmet clattering into the river. The sight of the fallen comrade sent a surge of fury through Edward's line. The archers tightened their bows, and the ridge fighters roared, their voices merging with the river's roar. A sudden flash of movement caught Edward's eye, a group of enemy soldiers attempting to flank the ridge from the left, slipping through a narrow cleft in the rocks. Without hesitation, Tomas signaled his men, and a handful of seasoned warriors broke from the ridge to meet the threat. The clash was swift and brutal. Steel met steel, and the scent of pine mingled with the coppery tang of fresh blood. The boy, now positioned beside a veteran archer, saw a lone enemy soldier break from the fray, his eyes wild with panic. With a breath that seemed to steady the world, the boy let loose an arrow that found the man's throat, the shaft sinking deep and silencing the scream that would have echoed across the valley. The battle swayed like a pendulum. For every advance the enemy made, a counter-strike from Edward's men pushed them back. The bridge, once a narrow crossing, became a crucible where lives were forged and shattered in equal measure. Tomas, his face streaked with soot and blood, fought side by side with his blacksmith, the latter wielding a hammer as effectively as any sword. Together, they drove a wave of attackers into the river, where the current claimed those who could not swim. Hours slipped by, each minute stretching into an eternity of shouts, cries, and the relentless clang of weapons. The mist that had cloaked the ridge in the night began to lift, revealing a sky bruised with the colors of dawn. Exhaustion weighed heavy on the soldiers, but the resolve that had sparked at the night's campfire burned brighter than ever. Edward, his armor dented and his sword stained, surveyed the field. The ridge still held, the bridge remained under their control, and the enemy's numbers were dwindling. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the battlefield, a signal from the rear. Edward turned to see the third group, the one he had led, emerging from the high ground behind the bridge, their banners fluttering despite the wind. They carried with them a cache of fire pots, their glass containers glowing ominously. With a coordinated shout, they hurled the incendiaries onto the enemy's remaining ranks, the resulting explosions sending arcs of flame into the air and scattering the last of the opposition. When the smoke cleared, the valley fell into an uneasy silence. The river flowed steadily, its surface reflecting the flickering embers of the battlefield. Men on both sides lay still, some breathing shallowly, others already surrendered to the darkness. Edward lowered his sword, the weight of it suddenly feeling like a burden he could no longer bear. He glanced at the boy, whose eyes now shone with a mixture of triumph and sorrow, and at Tomas, whose hands still trembled from the hammer's last strike. In the distance, the mournful horn that had first warned them of the enemy's approach sounded again, this time a low, reverent note that seemed to honor the fallen rather than herald further conflict. The company gathered what they could, wounded comrades, the few remaining supplies, and the battered map that had guided them here. They knew the river still needed to be crossed, that the ford beyond the bridge waited, and that the war was far from over. Yet, as the first light of day bathed the valley in gold, a fragile hope settled among them, as steady as the stones of the ridge they had defended. The river's current, though swollen from the night's rain, offered a narrow stretch where the stones rose like a broken spine. Edward knelt, feeling the cold mud seep through his gauntlets, and gestured for the men to follow. The boy, still clutching the bow that had become his first weapon, slipped forward, his boots finding purchase on the slick slabs. Tomas, his hammer now slung over his shoulder, helped hoist the wounded onto makeshift stretchers, his eyes never leaving the water's edge. As they waited, the mist that had lingered over the valley began to thin, revealing a low ridge on the far bank. Shadows moved there, figures cloaked in the same dark colors as the enemy they had just driven back. Edward's heart tightened. The horn's mournful note had been a warning, not a tribute. He raised his sword, its blade catching the pale dawn, and called out, "Hold! Stay together!" The men formed a tight line, shields interlocked, as the first of the silhouettes emerged. They were not a fresh wave of soldiers, but a band of refugees, gaunt and weary, clutching bundles of grain and children's toys. Their leader, a woman with a scar running the length of her cheek, stepped forward, hands raised in surrender. "We fled the siege of Arlen," she rasped, voice cracked by thirst. "The road ahead is blocked. The ford is our only chance." Her eyes flicked to Edward, searching for mercy. Edward lowered his sword, the weight of command easing into a reluctant compassion. He remembered the night's fire pots, the screams, the boy's trembling hands. "We will cross together," he said, his voice steady despite the fatigue that clung to his bones. "But the river is treacherous. Stay close and do not stray from the line." The group moved as one, the refugees' pace uneven, the children stumbling in the mud. The boy, now more confident, slipped a hand to a shivering child, offering a piece of dried meat he had salvaged from a fallen comrade's pack. Tomas, his hammer now a tool for building rather than breaking, fashioned a crude rope from a torn banner, securing it to a sturdy boulder to guide the wounded across. Halfway through the ford, a sudden roar split the air. From the opposite bank, a hidden contingent of enemy archers, their positions revealed by the rising sun, unleashed a volley of arrows. The sky filled with dark spears that whistled past shields and found gaps in armor. Edward shouted, "Take cover!" and the men dropped to their knees, the river's cold water splashing over them as they shielded their faces. The boy's bow sang a desperate counter melody, each arrow released with a precision born of the night's terror. He aimed for the archer's hands, for the string that sang death, and one by one the enemy fell, their bodies slipping into the river's churn. Tomas, wielding his hammer like a club, smashed a fallen archer's shield, sending a spray of water and blood into the air. When the last arrow thudded into the mud, a heavy silence settled, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. The enemy, realizing their advantage had vanished, retreated up the ridge, disappearing into the trees. Edward stood, chest heaving, and looked toward the far bank where the refugees waited, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Come," he called, extending a hand toward the woman with the scar. "We will guide you to the safe road beyond the valley." And she grasped his wrist, gratitude flickering in her gaze. The boy, his bow now slung across his back, followed, his steps lighter than they had been at dawn. Together they crossed the remaining stones, the river's roar fading behind them. On the far side, the sun broke fully over the hills, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the grass. The company set camp on a rise overlooking the valley, the map spread before them, the ford marked in ink and blood. Edward traced the route ahead with a fingertip, his mind already turning to the next obstacle, a mountain pass guarded by a warlord who coveted the very supplies they carried. The boy knelt beside the map, his eyes tracing the lines of the journey, and whispered, "We'll make it, sir." Edward placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the boy's pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and resolve. "We will," he replied, the words a promise forged in the crucible of battle, the hope that had settled at sunrise, now a fire that would drive them forward. The boy crouched low, his breath shallow as he traced the jagged outline of the cliff with his fingertip. A narrow ledge, barely visible beneath a veil of moss, snaked its way upward, disappearing into a dark mouth of stone. He whispered, "There's a crevice here, just wide enough for a rope." Edward turned, his eyes narrowing. "If we can get a line across, we can pull the others up one by one. Tomas, can you rig something?" Tomas hefted his hammer, the metal glinting in the waning light, and set to work. He tore strips from the torn banner that had once served as a flag, braiding them into a sturdy cord. With practiced hands, he knotted the ends and tossed the rope toward the crevice. The rope slipped through the fissure, catching on a jut of rock, and hung down like a lifeline. Felix, who had spent years navigating trade routes through rugged terrain, stepped forward. "The rock is loose," he warned, tapping the stone with a gloved hand. "If we pull too hard, it could give way." Edward nodded, his mind already calculating the risk. We'll move slowly. The children first, then the wounded. Keep the rope taut, Tomas. He gestured to Arya, who gathered the youngest refugees, cradling a trembling infant against her chest. With a steady rhythm, Tomas pulled the rope, and one by one the group clambered onto the ledge, their feet finding precarious footholds in the shallow cracks. The boy, his bow now slung across his back, followed the line, his eyes never leaving the cliff face, ready to catch anyone who slipped. Halfway up, a sudden gust rattled the stones, and a low rumble echoed from above. The warlord's scouts, hidden among the crags, emerged, their armor glinting like the cold of the mountain. Their leader, a hulking figure with a scarred face, raised a hand, and the men lowered their spears. "Turn back," the warlord's voice boomed, carried by the wind. "This pass is ours. Hand over your supplies, and we will let you live." Edward stepped onto the ledge, his sword drawn, the blade catching the thin slice of sun that pierced the clouds. "We will not be turned away," he replied, his voice steady. "We seek only safe passage for those who cannot defend themselves." The warlord laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the stone. "Then you will die here like the rest." A clash erupted as the warlord's men surged forward. Tomas swung his hammer, crushing a spearhead and sending a spray of stone into the air. Felix, quick on his feet, ducked behind a protruding boulder and thrust a hidden dagger into the thigh of an advancing guard. Arya, protecting the children, used a fallen branch as a makeshift shield, deflecting blows and ushering the little ones toward the rope. The boy loosed an arrow that whistled past the warlord's ear, embedding itself in the wooden shaft of his spear, snapping it in two. The battle was fierce but brief. The cliff's narrowness limited the number of attackers who could engage at once. Edward pressed the advantage, cutting a path toward the summit. With each fallen enemy, the rope tightened, pulling the remaining refugees higher. When the last of the warlord's men fell, a stunned silence settled over the ridge. The warlord himself, bloodied but unbowed, stared at Edward, his chest heaving. "You have earned my respect," he rasped. "The pass is yours for now. But know this, there are deeper dangers beyond the mountain." Edward lowered his sword, his gaze lingering on the warlord's gauntleted hand. "We will meet those dangers together," he said, extending a hand. The warlord hesitated, then clasped it, the grip firm despite the pain. "I am Garrick," he said. "My men will guide you through the pass. We share a common enemy in the warlord, who hoards the valley's supplies." With the unexpected alliance forged, the group continued upward, the rope now a symbol of their unity. The climb grew steeper, the air thinner, but the camaraderie among the strangers steadied their steps. As they reached the summit, the valley below unfolded like a tapestry of mist and pine, the river they had crossed now a silver thread winding far away. Beyond the ridge, the silhouette of a fortified gate rose against the horizon, the stronghold of Marcellus, the warlord who coveted their supplies. The boy stood at the edge, his eyes fixed on the looming fortress. He felt the weight of the journey settle on his shoulders, but also the fire that had been kindled in his chest since the river's roar. Beside him, Edward placed a hand on his shoulder, the promise still alive. "We have come this far," Edward said, his voice low but resolute. "Now we face the final test. Stay close, trust the rope, and remember why we fight." The wind whispered through the mountain passes, carrying with it the distant clang of metal and the faint echo of a battle yet to be fought. The company, now bolstered by new allies and hardened by trial, tightened their formation and began the descent toward the warlord's gate, each step a beat in the rhythm of a destiny they were determined to shape. Marcellus lifted a gauntleted hand, the iron clinking softly against the iron bands of the gate. "You speak of sharing," he said, his voice low, "but you have come through my lands with steel and fire. Trust is not given to those who have broken it before." He gestured to a low stone bench beside the entrance, and the tension in the air seemed to shift, as if the very stones were listening. Edward stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Marcellus's. "We did not seek war, only the chance to live," he replied. "Our people have starved while your stores sit untouched. If you open your granaries, we can all survive the winter." He glanced toward the children huddled behind Arya, their faces pale but hopeful. "Let us prove our good intent. Give us a single day's worth of grain, and we will return with a convoy of farmers to tend the fields beyond the ridge. In turn, we will share the harvest with you." Marcellus considered the offer, his brow furrowing. He turned, and a younger commander stepped forward, a scar running the length of his cheek. "My lord, the boy's arrow struck my spear." "He is a child, perhaps a sign," the commander whispered, eyes flicking to the boy who still clutched his bow. "He may be useful." The boy, Leo, felt the weight of the stair and tightened his grip on the bowstring. He had never spoken to a warlord before, but the fire in his chest steadied. "If you need a scout, I can guide you through the passes," he said, voice trembling but firm. "I know every hidden trail, every rock that can be used for ambush. Let me prove I am more than a target." Marcellus's lips curled into a thin smile. "Very well, child. You will lead a party of my men to the northern ridge tomorrow at dawn. If you return unharmed, we will speak of grain." He turned to his guards. "Prepare a modest portion of our stores for the travelers. They will eat tonight, and we will see if your promise holds." A murmur rippled through the group. Tomas, still gripping his hammer, exchanged a glance with Felix, who nodded subtly. Arya stepped forward, her eyes soft but fierce. "We will honor our word," she said, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. "And we will protect you, as you have protected us." The night fell quickly over the valley, the sky a tapestry of stars reflected in the river's distant silver thread. Around a modest fire, the refugees ate the grain Marcellus had granted, a simple, coarse loaf that tasted of hope. Edward sat beside Leo, sharing stories of the mountains they had crossed, while Garrick kept a watchful eye on the gate, his mind already mapping routes for the next day's trek. When the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the party assembled. Leo led a small contingent. Edward, Tomas, Felix, Arya, and a handful of the children, all cloaked in the muted colors of the valley. Behind them, Marcellus's men formed a disciplined line, their armor glinting in the pale sun. The rope that had once bound strangers together now hung loosely from Edward's belt, a reminder of the fragile trust that held them all. The trek to the northern ridge was arduous. The path narrowed to a jagged ledge, wind whipping the pine needles into a frenzy. Leo moved ahead, his eyes scanning the terrain, pointing out a concealed alcove where a sudden storm could turn the ground to mud. At one point, a loose stone gave way beneath Tomas's boot, sending him sliding toward a sheer drop. Felix reacted instantly, lunging forward and grabbing Tomas's arm, pulling him back to safety. "Your hammer may break stone, but a steady hand saves lives," Felix whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. They reached the ridge by midday, the valley below a sea of mist. From this height, the fortified gate of Marcellus appeared smaller, its walls less imposing. Leo knelt, laying a small bundle of herbs at the foot of a stone marker, a token of gratitude to the spirits of the mountain. He turned to the commander who had accompanied them. "The pass ahead is guarded by a band of raiders who have taken refuge in the old quarry. If we can drive them out, the road to the valley will be safe for trade." The commander nodded, impressed by the boy's insight. "Your knowledge is valuable, child. We will move at once." With a coordinated signal, the men of Marcellus surged forward, their swords flashing. Leo, Edward, and the others followed, the rope now coiled at their sides, ready to be used if the terrain demanded. The quarry was a cavernous hollow, its walls scarred by previous battles. Shadows moved within, the raiders' silhouettes flickering like ghosts. A sudden shout rang out as one of the raiders spotted the approaching force. "Defend the quarry. No one passes without blood." The clash erupted, steel meeting steel, the echo resonating through the stone. Edward fought with the same resolve that had carried him up the mountain. He parried a thrust, then drove his blade into the raider's shield, forcing it aside. Tomas, wielding his hammer, smashed a wooden support, sending a cascade of rocks that blocked the enemy's retreat. Felix slipped through the chaos, his dagger finding gaps in armor, while Arya shielded the children who had been ushered into a safe corner of the quarry. After a fierce struggle, the raiders were driven back, their banners torn, their morale shattered. The quarry fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of the victors. Leo stood amid the dust, his bow lowered, eyes bright with triumph. "The road is clear," he announced. "Now the valley can trade, and the people can survive." Marcellus's commander approached, his armor dented but his posture proud. "You have done well, child," he said, extending a hand. "Your leader will hear of this." He turned, signaling the men to return to the gate. As the party descended the ridge, the rope swayed gently in the wind, a silent witness to the fragile alliance forged in fire and steel. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that stretched toward the fortified gate, where Marcellus waited, his expression unreadable but his eyes reflecting a new calculation. The future of the valley hung in the balance, and the rope, once a lifeline, now a symbol of trust, linked the fates of all who dared to walk it. Marcellus gestured to the empty seat opposite him, and Leo took it, his fingers still tingling from the cold wind on the ridge. The commander settled at the far end, his armor clinking softly as he adjusted his position. Edward, Tomas, Felix, and Arya formed a semicircle, each feeling the weight of the moment settle like dust on their shoulders. "We have a choice," Marcellus began, his voice low but resonant in the stone-walled chamber. "The valley thrives on trade, but it also feeds the ambitions of those who sit beyond the mountains. The raiders were but a symptom of a deeper rot." Leo's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, my lord?" "The guilds that control the caravans have grown greedy," the commander interjected. "They demand higher tolls, and the miners in the eastern hills are forced to work longer hours for less grain. Discontent spreads like wildfire, and the raiders were hired by a faction that wants to cripple our supply lines." Felix leaned forward, his dagger still sheathed at his belt. "So the quarry battle was a diversion?" Marcellus nodded. "Exactly. While we fought the raiders, a small band slipped into the southern pass and sabotaged the bridge that leads to the river crossing. If that bridge collapses, the valley will be cut off from the southern markets for months." Tomas slammed his hammer lightly on the table, the metal ringing. "Then we must repair it before the next caravan arrives. We cannot afford another siege." Arya placed a hand on the rope coiled near the doorway, its fibers still damp from the morning mist. "The rope has served us well. Perhaps it can be used to reinforce the bridge while we rebuild." Marcellus smiled faintly. "Your suggestion is wise, child. The rope is more than a symbol, it is a tool of unity. If each of you takes a strand and ties it to the bridge, the people will see that the defenders of the valley are bound together." Leo rose, his bow slung across his back, and addressed the group. "Then we move at once. Edward, you and Tomas can lead the men to the southern pass. Felix and I will scout the riverbank for any hidden threats. Arya, you stay here with the commander to coordinate the repairs and keep the rope ready." The commander rose, his eyes scanning the faces around the table. "There is one more matter," he said, his tone turning grave. "A messenger arrived at the gate this morning, bearing a seal from the High Council of the North. They request an audience with Marcellus, claiming they have intelligence about a larger force gathering beyond the western ridge." A murmur rippled through the room. The rope still hanging from the beam seemed to sway ever so slightly, as if listening. Marcellus stood, his stature filling the doorway. "We cannot ignore the council, but we must also protect our own people. I will send a delegation to the High Council, but the valley's safety cannot wait. Leo, Edward, Tomas, Felix, your tasks are clear. Return before dusk and bring word of any new threats. The group dispersed with purpose, the echo of their boots against the stone floor a steady rhythm. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting a golden sheen over the market stalls where merchants shouted prices and children chased each other between barrels of grain. Leo and Felix slipped into the shadows of the alleyways, moving toward the river bank. The water glimmered, a ribbon of silver cutting through the valley, and the broken bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks splintered and its stone arches cracked. "Look," Felix whispered, pointing to a faint trail of footprints leading away from the wreckage. "Someone has been here recently, perhaps the saboteurs." Leo crouched, examining the prints. They were shallow, made by light boots, and the mud bore a faint scent of pine resin. "They came from the western woods," he murmured. "We should follow." Meanwhile, Edward and Tomas rallied a contingent of soldiers, their banners snapping in the wind as they marched toward the southern pass. The path wound through a narrow gorge, the walls rising like silent sentinels. As they approached the broken bridge, the men set to work, hauling timber, laying stone, and weaving the rope into the structure's support beams. The rope's fibers, dyed a deep indigo, stood out against the pale wood, a visual promise that the valley would not fall. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of amber. The bridge took shape, sturdy enough to bear the weight of a caravan, yet still bearing the marks of hurried repair. Edward clapped Tomas on the shoulder. "Your hammer still sings," he said, admiration in his voice. Back at the riverbank, Leo and Felix followed the trail deeper into the forest. The pine canopy filtered the light, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. They emerged into a clearing where a small encampment lay, its tents patched with canvas and its fire low. Figures huddled around, their faces hidden beneath hoods. One of them lifted a hand, revealing a scarred cheek. "You shouldn't have come," the man growled, brandishing a short sword. Felix's eyes narrowed. "We know why you sabotaged the bridge. The High Council's envoy will not be pleased." The scarred man laughed, a harsh bark. "The Council sends its pawns, but the real power lies with the Shadow Guild. They have been feeding the raiders, the saboteurs, and now they plan to seize the valley's trade routes entirely." Leo tightened his grip on his bow, an arrow already nocked. "Then we stop them here." A fierce skirmish erupted, the clatter of steel against steel echoing through the trees. Felix moved like a shadow, his dagger finding gaps in armor, while Leo's arrows whistled, striking the ground near the attackers' feet, forcing them to retreat. The scarred man fell, clutching his wound, his eyes meeting Leo's with a mixture of fear and respect. "Tell your master," the man gasped, "that the valley will not be taken without blood." Leo lowered his bow, his breath steady. "We will be ready." When the last of the assailants fled into the night, Leo and Felix gathered the remnants of the encampment, maps, crude notes, and a sealed parchment bearing the emblem of the Shadow Guild. They slipped the rope from its coil, unspooling a length long enough to bind the parchment, and tucked it safely into Leo's satchel. As twilight settled, the two returned to the valley, where the repaired bridge stood illuminated by torches. The commander greeted them, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "Did you find what you sought?" he asked. Leo unfolded the parchment, revealing a crude sketch of a hidden pass beyond the western ridge, marked with the symbol of a black serpent coiled around a sword. "The Shadow Guild plans to strike from the western ridge," he reported. "They have already positioned forces to cut off the valley from the north." Marcellus stepped forward, his eyes scanning the map. He placed his hand on the rope that still lay on the table, its fibers now intertwined with the fate of the valley. "Then we must act before they move. We will send a messenger through the pass, using the rope as a line of communication. If they think they can surprise us, they will find that we are already bound together." The room fell silent, each participant feeling the weight of the rope, the weight of their choices. Outside, the valley's lights twinkled like stars, and the river flowed steady beneath the newly forged bridge, carrying with it the promise of trade, of survival, and of a unity that no single blade could break. The rope, coiled at Alara's belt, sang softly as they descended a narrow gorge where the walls narrowed to a sheer stone throat. Aaron moved with a practiced ease, his boots finding footholds that seemed invisible to anyone else. Every few steps he paused, testing the air for the faintest scent of smoke or the distant echo of a drumbeat. Ilara kept her eyes low, the blade at her side glinting in the pale moonlight that filtered through the jagged cracks above. Halfway through the pass, a low, guttural chant drifted up from a cavern hidden behind a veil of ivy. Aaron halted, his hand gripping the rope tighter. "The guild scouts," he whispered. "They've set a watch post here, but they're not expecting anyone to come from this side." He slipped a small, sharpened stone from his satchel and tossed it into the darkness. The stone clanged against rock, and a moment later a pair of hulking silhouettes emerged, their armor patched with the same black serpent emblem that had haunted the valley's maps. Ilara's breath caught, but she did not draw her dagger. Instead, she lowered the rope and let it fall to the ground, forming a thin, taut line between her and Aaron. "If we can't fight them, we can outmaneuver them," she said, voice steady. Aaron nodded, and together they began to crawl along the rope, inching past the unsuspecting guards. The rope creaked under their weight, but the guards, focused on the stone's echo, never turned to see the shadow slipping by. Beyond the watchpost, the pass opened onto a high plateau that overlooked the western ridge. From this height, the valley stretched out like a tapestry of fireflies, the river a silver thread winding through it. At the far edge, a cluster of tents rose like dark teeth against the night sky, their flags bearing the black serpent fluttering in the wind. The Shadow Guild's main camp was unmistakable. Ilara crouched behind a boulder, the rope coiled at her feet like a silent promise. "We need to send word back to Marcellus," she said, eyes scanning the encampment. If we can get that rope to the commander, he'll know we've found their position and can coordinate an attack. Aaron gestured toward a narrow ledge that dropped steeply into a ravine below the camp. There's a hidden path that leads to the river's lower banks. We can tie the rope there, let it run downstream, and the current will pull it to the valley's main crossing. It'll be a line they can't cut without alerting us. She nodded, and together they slipped down the ledge, the rope sliding over the stone as they descended. The water below roared, a cold, relentless force that seemed to swallow the night. Ilara tied the rope to a sturdy oak root that jutted from the river bank, securing it with a series of tight knots she had learned from the old rope makers of the valley. The rope stretched taut, disappearing into the darkness, its fibers humming with the promise of a message delivered. Just as they finished, a torch flickered to life on the far side of the camp. A voice, low and commanding, called out in the guttural tongue of the guild. The scouts have reported movement on the western ridge. Prepare the serpents. Aaron's eyes widened. They've spotted us. He lunged forward, pulling Ilara to her feet. Run! They sprinted back up the ledge, the rope snapping against the rocks as they fled. The guards, now aware of the intrusion, surged forward, their swords flashing in the torchlight. Ilara's heart hammered as she dodged a thrust, the blade grazing her cloak. She turned, pulling Aaron with her, and together they vaulted over a low wall, crashing into the dense underbrush of the forest beyond the pass. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of blood. Behind them, the roar of the camp grew louder, the guild's war drums beating a relentless rhythm. Ilara clutched the rope's end, feeling the weight of the valley's fate in her palm. "We'll make it back," she whispered, more to herself than to Aaron. "We have to." The forest seemed to close around them, the trees forming a vaulted corridor that guided their hurried steps toward the valley. Somewhere ahead, the lights of the settlement flickered, a beacon of hope that now pulsed in time with the rope's steady pull. The Shadow Guild had revealed its hand, but the valley's defenders were already moving, bound together by a single strand of rope and a resolve forged in fire and steel. Marcellus turned to the map spread across a rough wooden table, the candlelight flickering over the inked lines of the valley. He traced a finger along the river's curve, then pointed to the narrow gorge where Ilara had tied the rope. "The current will carry it to the crossing at Dawnbridge," he said. "If the commander receives it before first light, we can coordinate a pincer, our archers on the ridge and the militia at the bridge. The guild won't expect us to strike from two sides." Ilara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the rope coiled in her hand. "The rope is secure, but the guild will send scouts downstream. We need a way to hide the message until it reaches the commander." She glanced at Aaron, who was already scanning the perimeter of the settlement. "There's an old stone tunnel beneath the mill. It runs parallel to the river for a mile before emerging near the crossing. If we slip the rope into the tunnel, the water can't wash it away, and the guild won't think to look there." Marcellus nodded, his jaw set. Gather the men. We'll send a small team to the tunnel with you. The rest will fortify the ridge and set the traps we've been planning for weeks. He gestured to a group of seasoned hunters who were already loading crossbows. You'll have the night to move the rope. Once it's in place, we'll light the signal fires on the ridge. When the guild sees the flames, they'll think we're retreating, but we'll be ready to strike. The night deepened as the settlement buzzed with hurried activity. Ilara slipped the rope through the narrow opening of the tunnel, feeling the cool stone walls press against her arms. The tunnel was damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and distant water. She could hear the faint rush of the river above, a reminder of the urgency of their task. Aaron followed, carrying a lantern that cast wavering shadows on the moss-covered stones. Together they pushed the rope deeper, securing it to a rusted iron bracket that jutted from the tunnel's wall, ensuring it would not be swept away. Above ground, the militia worked feverishly. Wooden palisades were erected along the ridge, and sharpened stakes were driven into the soil at the crossing. Archers took their positions, their bows humming as they nocked arrows, eyes scanning the dark horizon for any sign of the guild's serpents. Marcellus stood at the edge of the settlement, his cloak billowing in the night wind, and raised a hand to signal the start of the signal fires. A low, steady crackle rose as torches were lit, their orange glow climbing the cliffs and spilling across the valley like a warning. Just as the last torch flared, a distant howl cut through the night, a low, guttural chant that rose from the Shadow Guild's camp. The war drums grew louder, a thunderous rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. From the ridge, a silhouette emerged, a lone rider on a black horse, the guild standard fluttering behind him. The rider raised a hand, and the serpent's banners snapped in the wind, their black scales glinting ominously. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The rope, now hidden in the tunnel, would soon be pulled by the river's current toward Dawnbridge. If the commander received it in time, the valley's defenders could turn the tide. She glanced at Aaron, whose eyes burned with fierce determination. "We've done what we can," he whispered. "Now we wait." Marcellus turned his gaze toward the approaching darkness, his voice steady as he addressed the assembled fighters. "The Shadow Guild thinks they have the night on their side. Let them hear the sound of our arrows and the clang of our steel. When the rope reaches the commander, we strike as one." The words hung in the cold air, a promise that the valley would not fall without a fight. The river below surged, carrying the rope toward its destiny, while the valley held its breath, poised on the edge of a battle that would decide the fate of every soul who called the valley home. The river roared louder as it surged past the jagged rocks, the rope snapping against the current like a silver thread pulled taut by fate. Down at Dawnbridge, the commander, Lord Lysander, a veteran of 3 wars, stood on the stone parapet, his eyes narrowed against the spray. When the rope slammed against the iron ring he had placed at the far end of the bridge, a shout rose from his men. "The signal! The rope is here!" Lysander seized the rope, his calloused hands gripping the frayed fibers. He turned to his second, a grizzled veteran named Torin, and barked, "Raise the drawbridge. Let the serpents think they have the high ground, then we'll bring the valley down on them." Torin gave a curt nod, and the massive wooden bridge that spanned the churning river began to lift, its hinges creaking under the weight of centuries. As the planks rose, a hidden mechanism, an ancient counterweight Lysander had restored years ago, released a volley of iron spikes that fell into the riverbed, ready to impale any enemy that dared cross. Back on the ridge, Marcellus felt the tremor of the bridge's movement through the earth. He raised his sword, its blade catching the firelight, and shouted the signal that had been rehearsed in whispered meetings. Now! The archers released a rain of arrows that sang through the night, striking the black banners of the Shadow Guild and tearing the darkness with flashes of white. The lone rider on the black horse, Verk, saw the sudden blaze of arrows and the sudden rise of the bridge. He spurred his mount forward, the serpents at his side hissing in unison. Their scales reflected the torchlight, turning the night into a river of moving shadows. Verk raised his hand, and the guild's war drums fell silent for a heartbeat, replaced by a guttural chant that seemed to rise from the very stones of the valley. From the tunnel, Ilara and Aaron heard the distant clash and felt the ground shudder. Ilara's lantern flickered, casting a wavering glow on the damp walls. She pressed her back against the cold stone, listening as the battle unfolded above. "We've bought them time," she whispered to Aaron, "but the real fight is just beginning." Aaron tightened his grip on his own makeshift weapon, a sturdy branch reinforced with iron bands. "Then we'll meet them where they think they're strongest," he replied, his voice low but fierce. He slipped a small satchel from his belt, revealing a handful of powdered nightshade, and scattered it into the river's current. The powder dissolved, turning the water a dark, oily green that would soon coat the guild's boots as they attempted the crossing. The first wave of serpents surged forward, their bodies coiling around the bridge's railings. As they stepped onto the raised planks, the hidden spikes snapped upward, impaling the lead serpent and sending a spray of blood across the water. The guild's warriors roared in anger, but the sudden loss of their vanguard sowed confusion. Verk, sensing the trap, urged his horse to a gallop, attempting to leap the bridge entirely. The black horse's hooves struck the air, and for a breathless moment the rider seemed to hover above the abyss. Marcellus, seeing the rider's daring move, gave the order to unleash the hidden nets that had been woven into the ridge's trees. Thick cords of rope weighted with stones fell like a curtain, ensnaring the black horse's legs. Verk's scream cut through the clamor, a raw animal sound that echoed off the cliffs. The rider fought to free himself, but the net tightened and the horse stumbled, its hooves slipping on the slick, nightshade-tainted water. A sudden crack split the night as one of the militia's crossbowmen, a young woman named Selene, let loose a bolt aimed at Verk's heart. The arrow found its mark, piercing the rider's breastplate and sending him sprawling into the river. The black horse, now unbridled, thrashed wildly before being dragged downstream by the current, its mane tangled in the nightshade black water. The valley erupted in a chorus of battle cries. Ilara, hearing the clash, slipped out of the tunnel's mouth, her boots splashing in the shallow stream that fed the river. She emerged onto a rocky outcrop, eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. Beside her, Aaron stood, his face smeared with grime, his eyes alight with a fierce resolve. "The rope did its work," he said, gesturing to the tangled mess of serpents and steel. "Now we finish what we started." Lysander from the bridge raised his sword high, the blade catching the firelight. "For Dawnbridge, for the valley," he shouted, and his men surged forward, charging the remaining guild forces with a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. The clash of steel rang out, mingling with the thundering drums that now beat a frantic, uneven rhythm, no longer a signal of intimidation, but a heartbeat of desperation. In the midst of the melee, Ilara spotted a figure slipping through the chaos, a cloaked emissary of the Shadow Guild, clutching a satchel that glimmered with a faint, violet hue. She recognized the sigil on his cloak, the twin serpents coiled around a moon, the mark of the guild's inner council. Without hesitation, she lunged, her dagger flashing in the torchlight. The emissary turned, a cruel smile curling his lips, and thrust a hidden blade toward her chest. Their weapons clashed, sparks flying, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to the hiss of steel and the pounding of their hearts. Aaron, hearing the clash, surged forward, swinging his reinforced branch with a force that sent the emissary stumbling back. The satchel slipped from his grasp, spilling its contents, small glowing orbs that pulsed with a soft, violet light. The orbs rose into the air, hovering like captive stars, and then burst, releasing a wave of cold that washed over the battlefield, freezing the ground beneath the guild's remaining soldiers. The sudden frost cracked the stone beneath the serpents' feet, sending many of them sliding into the river, their black scales flashing like shards of night. Verk, still clinging to the net, was pulled under by the icy current, his lifeless form disappearing into the dark water. The remaining guild warriors, shivering and disoriented, fell back, their banners snapping uselessly in the wind. When the last of the serpents lay still, and the final echo of the war drums faded, a heavy silence settled over the valley. Smoke curled from the smoldering torches, and the river, now calm, reflected the pale light of the rising moon. Ilara stood, breathing hard, her sword slick with blood, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of further danger. Beside her, Aaron lowered his branch, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion but his spirit unbroken. Marcellus approached, his cloak damp from the spray, and placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder. "You both have given us the night we needed," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "The valley lives because of you." Lysander descended from the bridge, his armor dented but his posture regal. He raised his sword once more, this time not in command but in tribute. "Tonight we have shown that even the deepest shadows cannot swallow the light of a united people," he declared. "Let this be the first of many victories, and may the river carry our story downstream, so that Every village that drinks its water knows the price of freedom. The survivors gathered around a central fire, its flames licking the night sky, casting long shadows that danced like the serpents they had just vanquished. Ilara sat on a fallen log, her fingers still trembling around the hilt of her dagger. Aaron pulled a battered map from his pack, spreading it on the ground. "We still have to secure the passes beyond the ridge," he said, tracing a line with his thumb. "The guild will regroup, and they will come again." Marcel continued. Marcellus turned back toward the fire, his eyes catching the glint of the violet orbs that still lingered in the ash. He knelt, gathering the remnants of the shattered crystals, and placed them in a leather satchel. "These will keep the frost at bay for a while," he murmured, "but we cannot rely on them forever." Lysander stepped forward, his armor clinking softly. "We need a forward outpost at the ridge's crest. If the guild sends scouts, we must be the first to strike." Aaron spread the map again, his thumb tracing a narrow trail that wound up the eastern slope. "The old watchtower sits here," he said, pointing to a crumbling stone structure perched on a jagged outcrop. "It's been abandoned for years, but its height gives us a view of the entire valley. If we can repair its signal fires, we'll have early warning of any movement." Ilara rose, the weight of her dagger suddenly feeling lighter in her hand. "I'll lead a team to the tower," she declared. "We'll need timber, rope, and a few men who can handle the climb. The guild will try to block the ridge. We must be ready to fight on narrow stone." Marcellus nodded, his mind already turning to logistics. "I'll send riders to the villages downstream. They'll bring fresh provisions and a handful of spearmen. The river can carry us faster than any road, and the current is still strong enough to deter any lingering serpents." Lysander placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, his grip firm. "You have proven yourself in battle, Ilara. Trust your instincts. The night may be dark, but the fire within you burns brighter than any moon." The fire crackled louder as a gust of wind swept through the valley, sending sparks into the night sky. In the distance, the faint howl of wolves rose, a reminder that the wilderness still held its own perils. Yet the warriors felt a renewed purpose surge through their veins. By dawn, a small contingent, Ilara, Aaron, 2 seasoned hunters, and a handful of newly recruited villagers, set out toward the ridge. The path was steep, the stones slick with frost that had not yet melted. As they ascended, the wind grew colder, and the air thinned, making each breath a visible puff. Halfway up, a low rumble echoed from the cliffs below. The ground trembled, and a cascade of ice shattered from the overhang, spraying the travelers with shards that sang as they struck metal and flesh. Ilara raised her dagger, deflecting the worst of the spray, while Aaron swung his branch, sending the icy debris scattering. "Guild scouts!" Aaron shouted, spotting silhouettes moving like shadows among the rocks. Their armor was dark, etched with the twin serpents, and they carried spears tipped with the same violet crystals that had frozen the battlefield. The clash was swift. Ilara's blade flashed, finding gaps in the enemy's armor, while Aaron's branch, reinforced with iron bands, cracked shields and sent men sprawling. The hunters loosed arrows that sang through the cold air, each finding a mark. The villagers, though inexperienced, formed a shield wall, their resolve hardening with each passing moment. When the last scout fell, the wind died down, leaving a hushed silence broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. At the summit, the old watchtower loomed, its stones weathered but still standing. Inside, cobwebs clung to the walls, and a rusted bell hung from the rafters. Ilara climbed the narrow stairs, her boots echoing on the stone. She pulled the bell rope, and a deep, resonant tone rang out across the valley, a sound that would carry for miles. "The tower is ours," she called down, her voice carrying over the wind. Lysander arrived moments later, having taken a different route to ensure the ridge was clear. He surveyed the horizon, his eyes narrowing as he saw a faint plume of smoke rising from the western pass. "They're already moving," he said, his tone grim. "The guild has not forgotten defeat." Marcellus, who had followed the group on horseback, dismounted and spread a fresh map on a stone slab near the tower's entrance. He traced a line from the western pass to a hidden canyon that cut through the mountains. "If we can block that canyon, we can funnel the guild into a choke point," he explained. "But we'll need more men, and we'll need to act before dawn." Ilara looked out over the valley, the river glinting in the early light, the remnants of the night's battle still smoldering in the distance. She felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders, but also a fierce determination. "We will hold the ridge," she said, turning to her companions. "We will fortify the tower, seal the canyon, and we will meet the guild on our terms. The river will carry our story, but it will also carry their defeat." The group set to work, hauling timber up the steep path, reinforcing the tower's walls and fashioning makeshift barricades along the canyon's mouth. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the valley, the sound of distant drums began to echo faintly from the western hills, a warning that the Shadow Guild was already on the move, and the next chapter of the war was about to begin. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace of gold and shadow. From the ridge, Ilara could see the first glint of armor cresting the western hills, the twin serpents of the Shadow Guild catching the light like dark constellations. Their banners fluttered, stitched with the same violet sigil that had frozen the cliffs the night before. A low, guttural chant rose from their ranks, a rhythm that seemed to pull the very earth toward them. Aaron returned from the canyon with a triumphant grin, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. He and the villagers had hewed a massive slab of basalt into place, wedging it across the narrow throat of the gorge. The stone sat like a wall of night, its surface scarred by the tools of the locals, but sturdy enough to halt any advance. "The mouth is shut," Aaron called, wiping sweat from his brow. "If they try to force their way through, the rocks will crumble under their weight." Lysander moved along the tower's parapet, positioning sharpened stakes and arranging bundles of rope, that could be dropped to create a tangled snare. He whispered instructions to the younger fighters, teaching them how to strike at the legs of a charging rider and then retreat into the safety of the stone walls. "We'll turn their momentum against them," he said, his voice steady despite the distant thunder of drums. "When they charge, we'll pull the rope and the gorge will become a pit." Marcellus spread a fresh parchment over the stone slab, his ink-stained fingers tracing a new line that cut across the map like a blade. "There's a forgotten trail," he announced, pointing to a narrow fissure that wound behind the ridge, hidden by overgrown brambles. "It leads to the old quarry. If we can light the ancient forges there, we can melt the violet crystals before they reach us." Alara felt a sudden chill despite the heat. She turned to the edge of the tower and with a swift motion, slipped a rope over the railing, securing it to a sturdy beam. "I'll scout the trail," she said, her eyes fierce. "If there's a way to strike at their heart, we'll find it." She descended the stone steps, her boots thudding softly on the worn floor, and slipped out into the morning mist that clung to the valley floor. The first wave of guild soldiers emerged from the western pass, their formation tight, spears glinting with violet crystal tips. Their leader, a gaunt figure cloaked in midnight silk, raised a hand and the chant rose to a crescendo. With a swift motion, he thrust a crystal-tipped spear into the ground, and a pulse of cold radiated outward, frosting the grass in a thin, glittering sheet. The air grew sharp, and a thin veil of frost drifted toward the ridge, seeking any exposed skin. From the tower's highest window, Ilara watched the frost advance, her breath fogging the glass. She tightened her grip on the dagger at her belt and whispered a prayer to the river spirits that had guided her ancestors. Below, Aaron's villagers raised their shields, the metal clinking in a defiant rhythm that matched the drums of the enemy. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the clash of wills poised on the edge of a blade. A sudden crack split the air as a massive boulder, dislodged by the tremors of the approaching army, rolled down the slope toward the canyon entrance. Aaron shouted, and the villagers lunged, using the rope they had fastened earlier to yank the boulder into place. It slammed against the basalt wall, sealing the gorge with a thunderous roar that echoed across the valley. Dust rose, obscuring the view for a heartbeat, and when it settled the guild's forward line was halted, their advance stymied by the unexpected barrier. Lysander seized the moment, signaling his men to unleash a volley of flaming arrows. The arrows arced over the ridge, landing among the guild's ranks and igniting the violet crystals. A hiss rose as the crystals melted, releasing a plume of violet smoke that twisted like serpents in the sky. The leader of the guild snarled, his eyes flashing with fury, and raised a hand to summon a second wave. From the hidden trail, Ilara emerged into a clearing where the old quarry lay dormant, its stone walls blackened by centuries of neglect. She found the ancient forge, a massive stone hearth still intact, its iron doors rusted but functional. With a quick glance at the map, she located a cache of dry timber and kindling left by the villagers. She struck a flint, coaxing a spark that caught the dry wood, and soon the forge roared to life, its heat licking the cold air. The furnace's glow illuminated the quarry's depths, revealing a network of tunnels that led beneath the ridge. Ilara realized the tunnels could be used to slip behind the guild's lines. She called back to the tower with a sharp whistle, and Lysander, understanding instantly, ordered a small detachment to follow her into the darkness. As the sun reached its zenith, the valley became a battlefield of fire and ice, of light and shadow. The Shadow Guild pressed forward, their numbers swelling, but the defenders held firm, their resolve forged in the same fire that now burned beneath the ridge. Ilara, her dagger flashing in the forge's light, led her small band through the tunnels, ready to strike at the heart of the enemy and turn the tide of the war. The torchlight flickered against the stone as Ilara slipped forward, her boots soundless on the cold floor. She signaled to the two men beside her, and they melted into the darkness like wraiths. One of the guild soldiers, a hulking figure with a scarred cheek, leaned back against the wall, his axe resting on his knee. Ilara's dagger found the soft spot behind his ear, and with a single, practiced thrust the man crumpled silently, his breath stilled before it could escape. The second soldier, a younger recruit with a nervous twitch, turned just as the first fell. Before he could raise his voice, Lysander's second, a lithe scout named Myra, pressed a palm to his throat, the pressure enough to choke his scream. The scout's eyes widened in terror, then dimmed as the life drained from him. The remaining three guards, now aware that something unseen stalked them, tightened their grip on their weapons and spread out, forming a crude perimeter. Ilara moved like a shadow, her dagger flashing in the torchlight. She slipped behind the nearest guard, her blade finding the gap at his throat, and the man slumped without a sound. The last two, realizing the danger, tried to rally, but Myra's swift strike to each throat silenced them before they could shout. The tunnel fell into a hushed stillness, broken only by the distant crackle of the forge above and the muffled thuds of battle on the ridge. Ilara crouched beside the fallen men, pulling a small leather satchel from her belt. Inside lay a set of finely crafted lock picks, tools she had taken from the old quarry's storage room weeks earlier. With practiced hands she worked the rusted iron gate that barred the deeper passage, the tumblers clicking into place with a soft, satisfying clack. The gate swung open, revealing a narrow shaft that descended steeply into the heart of the ridge. Beyond the gate, a faint glow pulsed from a cavernous chamber, the light dancing off walls etched with ancient runes. The party slipped through the opening, the air growing warmer and tinged with the metallic scent of blood and iron. In the chamber's center stood a massive stone altar, its surface scarred by centuries of use. Atop it rested a crystal the size of a fist, its surface swirling with violet light, an artifact the Shadow Guild had been using to amplify their dark magic. Ilara's breath caught. This was the heart of the enemy's power. She exchanged a quick glance with Lysander, whose eyes burned with resolve. Without hesitation, Lysander raised his hand and whispered an incantation taught to him by the river spirits. A thin ribbon of water, invisible to the eye, curled around his fingers and surged forward, striking the crystal. The violet light flickered, then fractured, sending shards of dark energy scattering across the chamber. The crystal cracked, a high-pitched keening echoing through the tunnels as its power waned. Ilara seized the moment, thrusting her dagger into the altar's base. The stone shuddered, and a cascade of dust fell, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside the compartment lay a bundle of scrolls bound in leather, their seals marked with the sigil of the ancient Order of the River. Ilara unrolled one, its ink still fresh despite the ages. It detailed a forgotten rite, a convergence of fire and water that could seal the violet magic forever. She memorized the steps, her mind racing to commit each nuance to memory before the guild's reinforcements could flood the tunnel. Above ground, Lysander's detachment on the ridge unleashed a second wave of flaming arrows, this time tipped with oil harvested from the villagers' stores. The arrows arced over the ridge, landing among the guild's rear ranks and igniting a line of supply wagons. Smoke rose in thick black plumes, obscuring the enemy's view and sowing panic. The guild's leader roared orders, but his voice was swallowed by the chaos. Back in the tunnel, Ilara and her band moved swiftly toward the exit, the cracked crystal still humming faintly. As they emerged into a narrow cleft overlooking the battlefield, they saw the enemy's formation breaking, soldiers scrambling to extinguish the sudden blaze that threatened their armor. Ilara raised the scroll and began the rite, chanting the ancient words while Lysander poured a basin of river water over the altar's remnants. The water met the lingering violet sparks, and a vortex of steam spiraled upward, swallowing the lingering darkness. The vortex burst, sending a wave of pure, silvery light across the ridge, washing over the guild soldiers and stripping away the enchantments that had bolstered them. The tide turned in an instant. The villagers, emboldened by the sudden surge of light, surged forward with renewed vigor. The shield of Aaron rang louder, the clang of steel now accompanied by the triumphant cries of those who had believed the river spirits would not abandon them. Ilara, dagger still glinting, led her small band down the slope, ready to press the advantage and drive the Shadow Guild from the valley once and for all. The night air grew cooler as the river's surface settled into a glassy sheen, reflecting the constellations that had guided their ancestors for generations. Ilara felt the lingering hum of the rite pulse through her veins, a reminder that the violet magic was not merely broken but sealed, its threads now woven into the river's own flow. Lysander, still wet from the ceremonial water, brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead and glanced downstream, where the floodwaters churned with the debris of battle. Beyond the immediate calm, a faint, rhythmic thrum rose from the depths of the gorge, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to echo the ancient drums of the order. Ilara's eyes narrowed. "The river is speaking," she whispered, recalling the old legend that the water could carry messages from the past. "There is more beneath the surface." Lysander knelt at the water's edge, cupping his hands to draw a small amount of the river's current. As the liquid slipped through his fingers, a shimmer of silver light coalesced into a translucent shape, a fleeting image of a vaulted hall, its walls etched with runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. The vision faded as quickly as it appeared, leaving a lingering scent of wet stone and incense. An old sanctuary, Lysander said, his voice low. One the order used to guard the true source of the river's power. If the Shadow Guild tapped into that, they could have a wellspring of darkness that even our right cannot touch. Ilara rose, her resolve hardening. We cannot leave that unchecked. The scrolls we recovered may hold the key to sealing the crystal, but they also speak of a convergence: fire, water, and earth. We have fire and water, we need the earth. A rustle behind them announced the arrival of the Order's riders, their armor still glinting with the remnants of battle. Their commander, a stern woman named Meles, dismounted and approached. "The scouts report movement in the western ravine," she said, eyes scanning the horizon. "A contingent of guild remnants has retreated into the old quarry, and they are carrying a blackened stone that thrums with the same violet hue we just shattered." Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. The stone was a fragment of the original crystal, perhaps a seed meant to regrow the dark core. If they reached the sanctuary, they could reignite the magic, she warned. Meles nodded. "We will split our forces. Lysander, you and I will lead a detachment to the sanctuary. Ilara, you must rally the villagers and secure the quarry. Use the fire you have. Ignite the earth with the oil barrels still smoldering. The rite requires the three elements to converge at a single point. If we can bind the fragment there, the darkness will be sealed forever." The villagers, still buzzing with adrenaline, gathered around Ilara. She raised her dagger once more, this time not as a weapon but as a symbol. "We have fought for our homes, for the river, for each other," she called. "Now we fight for the future of the valley. Light the oil, drive the stone into the earth, and let the river's song carry us through." With coordinated shouts, the villagers hurled the oil-soaked barrels into the quarry's cavernous mouth, igniting a blaze that licked the stone walls. The heat rose, meeting the cold, damp earth, and a plume of steam rose like a ghostly veil. Ilara stepped forward, placing the blackened fragment upon a stone altar she had hastily fashioned from the quarry's own rock. She poured the river water over it, and the flames licked higher, their orange tongues dancing with the violet ember of the fragment. A sudden, deafening crack split the air as the stone shattered, releasing a burst of violet energy that collided with the steam. The resulting vortex spiraled upward, a vortex of fire, water, and earth entwined. Light erupted from its core, brighter than any sunrise, and the darkness that had once seeped through the valley was drawn into it, swallowed whole. When the light faded, the quarry lay quiet, the air sweet with the scent of rain and ash. The fragment was gone, reduced to dust that the river would carry away. Lysander and Meles arrived moments later, their faces illuminated by the lingering glow. "The sanctuary is safe," Meles reported, her voice steady. The river's heart remains uncorrupted. Ilara lowered her dagger, feeling the weight of the battle lift from her shoulders. Around her, the villagers cheered, their voices rising in a hymn that blended with the river's gentle murmur. The valley, scarred but resilient, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet as the stars wheeled overhead, a solitary ripple disturbed the river's surface far downstream, a subtle, lingering echo that hinted at secrets yet unspoken, waiting for the day when the river would call upon its champions once more. Ilara felt the river's pulse quicken beneath her boots, a rhythm that matched the thrum still echoing in her veins. Lysander tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, eyes narrowed as he scanned the water for any sign of movement. The moon, a thin silver crescent, cast a pale path across the surface, illuminating the faint eddies that swirled around the lingering whirlpool. "Do you see that?" Ilara whispered, pointing to a darker sheen where the water seemed to fold upon itself. "It's not just a ripple. It's a doorway." Lysander stepped closer, his breath fogging in the cool night air. "A doorway to what?" Before either could answer, the water surged forward, and a slender shape rose from the depths, a creature of liquid and light, its body composed of translucent scales that caught the moon and refracted it into a kaleidoscope of blues and greens. Its eyes were deep pools of ancient knowledge, and when it opened its mouth, a soft, melodic hum resonated through the valley, vibrating the stones at their feet. "The river's keeper," Ilara breathed, remembering the old songs sung by the elders. "The guardians of the source. They appear only when the balance is threatened." The keeper's voice was not spoken but felt, a gentle pressure against Ilara's thoughts. Images flickered, a cavern hidden beneath the waterfall that fed the valley, a crystal heart pulsing with pure water magic, and a shadowed figure cloaked in the same violet hue that had once threatened the sanctuary. The vision faded, leaving a lingering chill. "The fragment we shattered was only a seed," the keeper conveyed. "Its kin lie deeper, bound to the source itself. If they awaken, the river will turn to a torrent of darkness, drowning the valley." Lysander's jaw tightened. "Then we must find this cavern before the seed sprouts." The keeper inclined its head, and a thin ribbon of water rose from the river, twisting into a luminous thread that hovered in the air. It stretched downstream, winding through the cliffs and disappearing behind a veil of mist that clung to the base of the waterfall. The thread pulsed faintly, as if inviting them to follow. Without hesitation, Ilara and Lysan turned toward the waterfall, the villagers' distant chants fading behind them. The path grew steep, slick with spray, and the roar of the falling water grew louder, a thunderous hymn that seemed to echo the earlier battle's climax. As they approached the base, the mist parted into a curtain of silver, revealing a narrow fissure in the rock, a hidden entrance concealed for centuries. Inside, the air was cool and scented with mineral richness. The walls glimmered with veins of quartz, and the floor was carpeted with smooth river stones that seemed to hum underfoot. At the heart of the cavern, set upon a pedestal of basalt, rested a crystal the size of a child's fist, its surface swirling with a faint violet luminescence that pulsed in time with Ilara's heartbeat. The keeper's presence lingered, a gentle pressure on their minds. Seal the crystal with the triad of elements once more, but this time bind it with the living memory of the valley. Only then will the darkness be barred forever. Ilara knelt, placing her dagger beside the crystal, its blade now etched with the symbols of fire, water, and earth that had guided them earlier. Lysander lifted a handful of ash from the quarry's smoldering remains, letting the embers drift into the air. The river's water, drawn from the very source they stood near, flowed into a shallow basin he had carved from the stone, its surface shimmering with reflected light. Together they began the rite anew. Ilara whispered the ancient verses taught by the elders, her voice steady despite the weight of destiny. Lysander scattered the ash, and the ember-filled wind spiraled upward, meeting the water's mist. The crystal responded, its violet glow intensifying, then softening into a pure white radiance that bathed the cavern in a gentle glow. A surge of energy rippled outward, and the fissure behind them sealed with a smooth, seamless stone, as if the mountain itself had closed its wound. The keeper's form shimmered one last time, its eyes reflecting gratitude, before dissolving into a cascade of droplets that merged with the river's flow. When the light dimmed, the crystal lay still, its surface now clear and calm, no longer poolsing with darkness. Ilara lifted the dagger, its blade now warm with the lingering fire of the rite, and felt a profound peace settle over her. Lysander placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softened by relief. Outside, the night sky stretched infinite, the stars brighter than ever, as if the valley itself had been given a new breath. The river sang a softer, steadier song, its waters carrying the promise of renewal downstream. Yet deep within its currents, a faint echo lingered, a reminder that vigilance would always be required, and that the river would one day call upon its champions again. The river's surface rippled with a sudden, deliberate pulse, as if a hidden heart had begun to beat beneath its calm exterior. Ilara felt the familiar tug of destiny, a faint vibration traveling up her spine, and she turned her gaze downstream where the water narrowed into a silvered gorge. There, half submerged among smooth stones, a small wooden box bobbed gently, its lid etched with the same triad of symbols that had guided their rite. Lysander stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "It wasn't there before," he murmured, reaching for the box. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, a soft chime resonated through the valley, echoing off cliffs and trees alike. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, lay a vellum scroll sealed with wax bearing the crest of the ancient order of the River Keepers, an order thought lost to legend. Ilara broke the seal, and the parchment unfurled to reveal a map of the valley, its ink shimmering with a faint azure hue. Along the winding lines, a new path was marked, leading beyond the familiar borders to a place labeled the Veiled Hollow. Beneath the illustration, a single line of script glowed. "When the crystal's light wanes, the hollow will call." There, the true source of the river's power lies dormant, awaiting the hands that remember. A sudden rustle in the nearby thicket drew their attention. From the shadows emerged a young girl, her hair braided with river reeds, eyes bright with curiosity. She stepped forward, clutching a small, polished stone that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the river's song. "I am Myra," she said, voice steady despite her youth. "My mother told me stories of the keepers. She said the river would speak to us when the world needed its guardians again." Ilara smiled, recognizing the same fire of purpose that had once burned in her own heart. "You have found the call, Myra," she replied, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "The river has chosen us once more." Together, the three of them set off along the newly marked trail, the valley waking around them as birds took to the sky, and the first warm breezes stirred the leaves. The path wound through ancient groves where trees grew so close their trunks intertwined like old friends, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and earth. As they progressed, the river's murmur grew louder, guiding them like a living compass. Hours later, they arrived at the mouth of a cavern hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. The entrance was framed by towering basalt columns, their surfaces etched with the same elemental sigils that had once guarded the crystal. Inside, the cavern opened into a vast chamber illuminated by phosphorescent fungi, casting a gentle green glow over a pool of water that seemed to hover above the stone floor, defying gravity. At the center of the pool floated a single luminous seed, its surface a swirl of violet and gold, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beat of Ilara's heart. The seed emitted a low hum, resonating with the crystal they had sealed months before. Myra stepped forward, her small hand outstretched, and the seed rose to meet her palm, settling there as if recognizing a kinship. A voice, ancient and resonant, filled the chamber without words. Images flashed in their minds. A time before the valley's first settlement, when the river was a conduit of raw, untamed magic. The rise of the first keepers who learned to bind that power with memory and intention. The betrayal that fractured the river's heart, sending darkness downstream. And finally, the promise that a new generation would restore the balance. Ilara felt the weight of those memories settle upon her, a tapestry of lives lived and lost, each thread woven into the river's flow. Lysander's grip tightened on his dagger, now a symbol of both protection and stewardship. Myra's eyes widened with awe, the seed's light reflecting in her gaze. "The veiled hollow is the wellspring," the voice seemed to say. "It is the source of the river's true strength. Guard it, nurture it, and the valley will endure. But should it fall, the darkness will rise anew, not from without, but from the very heart of the water itself." Understanding blossomed within them. The crystal they had sealed was only one facet of a larger whole. The seed was the counterpart, a living conduit that required guardianship. With reverence, Ilara placed the seed into a shallow cradle she fashioned from river stones, while Lysander whispered a vow of protection, his words echoing off the cavern walls. Myra, feeling the surge of ancient power, lifted her reed-braided hair, and sang a soft, melodic chant taught by her mother, a song of remembrance that wove the valley's collective memory into the very air. As her voice rose, the seed's glow intensified, and the pool's water rose in a gentle spiral, forming a luminous column that stretched toward the cavern ceiling, then dissolved into a cascade of sparkling droplets that fell like rain upon the stone floor. When the light settled, the cavern felt alive, humming with a steady, harmonious energy. The fissures in the basalt walls glowed faintly, as if acknowledging the renewed pact. Ilara, Lysander, and Myra stood together, feeling the river's pulse synchronize with their own hearts. Outside, the valley seemed to breathe anew. The sky, now a canvas of soft amber, reflected the promise of a day unburdened by looming shadows. Yet beneath the surface, the river's current carried the memory of this moment, a reminder that vigilance was not a burden but a rhythm, a song that would guide future generations. With the seed secured and the veiled hollow awakened, the three guardians turned back toward the village, ready to share the knowledge they had uncovered and to teach the people how to honor the river's living memory. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in many cycles, the valley's future felt anchored in hope, bound by the unbreakable bond between water, earth, fire, and the hearts that dared to protect them. Aki stepped forward, her gait deliberate despite the weight of years etched into her shoulders. She raised a hand, and the murmuring crowd fell into a hushed reverence, as if the very wind had been instructed to listen. "The river has spoken through you," she said, her voice low but resonant, "and it has chosen you three as its new keepers. Yet the river's memory is not a single thread. It is a tapestry woven with both light and shadow." She turned to Myra, whose eyes still glimmered with the seed's afterglow. "Child of the reeds, you carry the song of the ancestors. Teach it to those who have forgotten the cadence of water, for a song unsung soon becomes a silence that invites darkness." Myra nodded, feeling the responsibility settle like a stone in her chest, steady and unyielding. Lysander stepped beside Aki, his dagger now sheathed but his posture still alert. "We must fortify the veiled hollow," he declared, "and establish a network of guardians along the river's course. The fissures in the basalt walls are but the first of many veins that channel the river's power. If any one of them is left unattended, the darkness can seep back in." Ilara lifted the stone cradle, cradling the seed with both hands. The seed pulsed softly, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the valley. "We will create sanctuaries," she said, "places where the water can be tended, where memory can be recorded, and where the seed's light can be reflected. Each sanctuary will be tended by a keeper trained in the old ways and the new." A council formed on the village square, the elders and the youth gathering in a circle around the trio. Aki produced a weathered map, its edges frayed, its ink faded but still legible. She traced a line that followed the river's serpentine path, stopping at points where the water narrowed, where cliffs rose like sentinels, where ancient stones jutted from the banks. "These are the nodes," she explained, "the places where the river's memory pools most strongly. We will place smaller seeds, fragments of the veiled hollow's essence, within each node. They will act as beacons, warning us of any disturbance. Myra's fingers brushed the edge of the map, and a faint shimmer spread from her touch, illuminating the roots with a pale blue light. The villagers gasped, seeing the river's hidden veins revealed before their eyes. "The water remembers," she whispered, "and now we will help it remember us." As the day waned, the first sanctuary was erected at the foot of the eastern ridge, where a waterfall cascaded into a crystal pool. Ilara and a group of villagers gathered stones, arranging them in concentric circles, each stone etched with symbols of water, earth, fire, and air. When the final stone was set, they placed a shard of the original seed, cut carefully under the guidance of the ancient voice, into the pool's center. The water glowed, rippling outward, and a soft hum rose from the stone circles, echoing the song Myra had sung in the hollow. Lysander stood watch, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, a low rumble began to rise from the river's lower reaches, a sound that was neither water nor wind. He felt a prickle along his spine, a warning that the darkness, though held at bay, was already stirring elsewhere. He turned to Eki, who met his gaze with a calm that belied the tension in the air. "The river's heart beats," Eki said, "but every heartbeat summons a shadow. We must be ready to meet it not with fear, but with the harmony we have forged today." Night fell, and the village lights flickered like fireflies against the darkening sky. Around the newly lit sanctuary, the villagers gathered, sharing stories of the river's past, singing the ancient chant that Myra had taught them, and pledging to keep the memory alive. The seeds glowed dimmed to a steady ember, a promise that as long as they remembered, the valley would endure. In the quiet that followed, Aki slipped away from the circle, moving toward the edge of the forest where the river narrowed into a misty gorge. She knelt beside a moss-covered stone, placed her palm upon it, and closed her eyes. The river's voice rose within her mind, a low murmur that spoke of a hidden fissure downstream, a crack that had never been sealed, where the darkness still lingered, waiting for a chance to surge. She opened her eyes, the resolve in them as clear as the moonlight reflecting on the water. "We will need more than guardians," she whispered to the night. "We will need a covenant, a binding of all who walk this valley, that the river's memory may be carried in every heart, and that the darkness may never find a foothold again."